Welcome to Hickory Street Podcast. I'm gonna do another episode. This one is gonna be solo again. It's pretty early in the morning. Well, I mean, not like super early, but pretty early for me. It's Saturday, and I don't normally get up until like probably close to 11 on Saturdays. But I stayed up late last night watching this Bob Dylan documentary. It's about like the Rolling Thunder tour that essentially happened after a very long hiatus. Like Bob Dylan stopped playing or stopped touring in 1966, and so this documentary is based in 1974 when he went on this tour and lost a bunch of money because he just was doing what he wanted to do. It was pretty interesting, but anyways, so I want to talk about a few different things for this episode. First thing is bad professors. I realized in my last video I started to mention something about that, but I didn't actually go into it. So I went to UNT for 4 years and graduated with my history degree. But while I was going to school there, I had some really good professors and I had some really bad professors. And this is sort of applicable now because after I got out of college, I realized how much of a thought bubble I was in just being in school and having these professors essentially tell me how to think because that's what they were doing instead of like giving me the information and letting me come to my own conclusions, essentially. So I had one professor that was amazing, and it was probably simultaneously like the most challenging class that I took and the most rewarding. It was a Roman military history class. We went into the history of the Roman military, but also into the politics of Roman society. And I took it as sort of an elective history course. You had to have your like basic ancient history courses, and then you could choose a focus, which mine was American history. But within that focus, you had to choose like 2 or 3 elective history classes that had nothing to do with your focus. So, I took Roman military history, and it went into the politics of Roman society, going back to like the formation of the Republic and like how the formation of the Republic came to be. And essentially Rome was trying to unify Italy, but there were a lot of factions and tribes that did not want to be unified. And so Rome kept getting into these military conflicts with the surrounding Italian cities, and over time what ended up happening is Rome would conquer a city, essentially. They would have a treaty, an agreement that basically said they were part of Rome, but they wouldn't. They would protect the city from invaders, but they wouldn't govern them. So it was very much so like a Greek city-state, which, if you know anything about Roman history, the Romans mimicked their society off of the Greeks' standard. A lot of Romans practiced Greek mythology as their religion, because it was essentially their religion. They worshipped these they worshipped the figures in the myths, like Achilles and all of the. I don't know all of them. I'm being honest. I have too much information in my brain. I was actually having a conversation with my girlfriend last night about that, because I was like stuck on something. I couldn't remember it. And she was like, why can't you remember this? And I was like, I don't know. I have too much information in my brain. I have to use my memory for work all day. So, yeah. So I apologize. But you know the mythological creatures in Greek mythology, don't you? Anyways, yeah. So going back to this class, so the reason why that this professor was so effective is because, and it was, like I said, it was a very difficult class, was because he forced us to create our own arguments. So he gave us books to read and prompts to choose. So we could choose between 3 or 4 different arguments, and then we had to write like a 7-page or an 8-page paper minimum about the argument. And there were only like 4 grades throughout the class, so they were all based on these papers, and you had to use evidence from the books. So it was very mentally taxing, and you had to really know your stuff. And you had to have like read the book in its entirety, essentially. And I still own almost every book that I read in college, and those books in particular, probably the most interesting. We read about Sulla and Marius, and the fall of the Roman Empire. And then we learned about like how Rome went from being a republic to an empire. And it happened very, like, if you want to get into technicalities at least, Roman society changed from a republic to an empire fairly early on in its history. It was probably an empire for like close to 800 years or something like that, after it had kind of been established as a republic. And I think my okay. Hey, I'm doing a podcast episode. My girlfriend just came downstairs. You can come down here. Yeah. No, that's fine. I'm just going to be talking about Roman history and shit. So, yeah. I made coffee. You can get coffee if you want. Yeah, so my girlfriend will not work out with me today because she has not gotten her gym membership. Did you get it or no? It's not open yet. I thought you said it was open.
I drove by it
Oh, lame. Okay. Well, next time. Yeah, you could. You didn't bring clothes to work out in though, did you? Did you? All right. Well, let's do it later. Okay. So back to Roman history. So Rome became a republic, uh, essentially by unifying the currency or establishing a more legitimate currency, essentially. So they would conquer the surrounding cities in Italy, and they allowed people to use their own currency. They allowed these cities to use their own currency, but they also allowed them to use the Roman currency. And so, as Rome essentially kept establishing dominance over these Italian cities, their currency became worth more than these individual cities' currencies. And a lot of these cities still practiced like the bartering system for the most part anyway. So currencies didn't matter as much in those days. So it's not as a as it's not as I don't know how to say this. It's not as important as you might think it is, like in today's standard, where like even internationally, other countries have like a currency reserve in the U.S. dollar, so they have like an exchange. They have an exchange reserve, is what it's called, but they essentially just like take their currency and exchange it through a promissory note, essentially, for the U.S. currency in case their currency collapses, which is actually like a huge problem economically right now because the price of the US dollar has gone up. And so countries are like rushing to exchange their currency for the US dollar, which is sort of adding to our inflation problem. It's a really complicated thing, but anyways, so this professor asked a lot of questions in class, and one of the things that was, I think, really positive about the way he ran the class is that if you had a wrong answer, he didn't sugarcoat the fact that you were wrong. It was just kind of like, nope, moving on. And that happened to me a couple of times. He did not care about ego, and there were a lot of like students that had ego issues. So this is an example of a good professor that I had. There's one professor I can think of that was probably the worst professor I had while in college. Because one, the subject at hand was extremely complicated and not as cut and dry as she tried to make it be. But two, she ran the classroom kind of like a group therapy session. I mean, this professor literally cried like twice a week. I mean, it was like every class I had, she like broke down in tears, and it was really uncomfortable. And third, she actually encouraged her students to do the same. So like, not only was this teacher crying in front of everybody, but students were like having mental breakdowns, and it just became like this really weird psychosis that like it seemed like everybody was just super emotional, and I'm just like there to try to learn, and it was so confusing. I just remember like sitting in this class like thinking, why are we all just like breaking down about stuff unrelated to history right now? Because people were like sharing personal stories, and I don't know. It was really stupid. And then probably the fourth reason why she was my worst professor that I had is because she adopted the whole straight white men are the enemy doctrine, and it was like hella toxic. Like it was really bad. There was one time in particular. So we read this book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. It was a Middle Eastern history class. It was about the Palestinians and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians post World War I, post World War II, and in the establishment of Israel post World War II, because Israel didn't become a state until the end of the Treaty of Versailles. So this book it's an amazing book, and it's really fucked up what they did to the Palestinians. And this book goes into detail how the British and the French government, but mainly the British, took control of the region post World War I and started instituting all of these discriminatory laws, and had all of these capital punishments for the Palestinians in the establishment, and how they manipulated the local representatives in the Middle East to kind of go along with their cause, and how Egypt got involved post World War II to help establish the legitimacy of Israel, and how Syria also played a part in all of this, like through trading and like backing Egypt. And it was a really complicated class because I know quite a bit about World War II and the end of World War II, and this class goes into some of the complicated issues with the Treaty of Versailles, and see, unfortunately, America was put in a position to mediate the end of World War I, and whenever we were put into that position, we were completely isolationist up until that point, in a very similar way that Rome was isolationist until the end of the Second Punic War with Greece. So America was tasked with creating peace involving all of these foreign nations we didn't understand culturally. So Great Britain and France had taken hold of a lot of influence, not only in the Middle East, but also in India, post World War I, or during World War I, really. But as a way to kind of not rustle the feathers of our economic counterparts, essentially, because we were exporting and importing a lot of stuff from Britain. We essentially left their territories alone, and Britain created this agreement. It was like this secret agreement with France that they ended up like breaking or negotiating out of. I can't remember exactly what happened, but essentially France lost their territories either willingly or unwillingly. And France after World War One was not a very powerful nation, so they didn't have any like retaliation essentially. And so this created like a lot of issues for the Palestinians, and I'm not like discounting the fact that the Palestinians, suffered. They suffered immensely, and there's a huge problem with what has happened with the Palestinians being dispersed and just the diaspora. But in this book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, it goes into the complicated nature at the end of World War II. And at the end of World War II, what essentially happened is the Jewish population in modern day Israel, because the Palestinians were sort of subject to rule under the Ottoman Empire before World War One, and then after World War One, the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist. But the Ottoman Empire, and this was like sort of propagandic in the class. She really like sugarcoated this to establish her point, essentially. But the Ottoman Empire kind of ruled over modern day Israel, and it was like they ruled over most of the Middle East outside of Egypt. Egypt has always been kind of independent, but except for like a short period of time, I think. But anyways, so the Ottoman Empire ruled over this region. At the end of World War One, the Ottoman Empire falls, and the British are occupying all of these territories. And this class goes into the rule of the Ottoman Empire, and she tried to say that the Ottoman Empire, after they would conquer an area, kind of just left them alone and they would live peacefully. And that's like not entirely true. It's always like, it's never one thing. And that's what kind of bothers me about people who, like, I don't know, use pieces of history to justify a point, because you cannot do that. You cannot do that with history. It's too complicated. So what really happened is the Ottoman Empire would rule over these areas, and they would live peacefully amongst each other unless they stopped adhering to a certain set of culturally imposed propositions. And the Palestinians just so happened to be like one of the more, I guess, sanctioned group of people within the Ottoman Empire. So they held a lot of protections, and they had a lot of cultural influence. But after World War One, they lost all that cultural influence, and there was this issue in Britain of anti-Semitism that started to propagate, and the populace in Britain essentially started to criticize the British government for anti-Semitic foreign policies. And so the British government, after World War I, started to get more and more scrutiny from their own people about their foreign affairs, and specifically to the Jewish government, or to the Jewish people. And so what they did is they essentially started to impose a lot of pro-Jewish policies, and what the unintended consequence of that is that in the Middle East, these pro-Jewish policies allowed for a very harsh treatment, kind of over any other religious belief, and it just kind of slowly started to propagate more and more. And so in the Middle East, what ended up happening is people of a Jewish faith had a higher social standing and a higher political standing in society, and they started to just take the land of the Palestinians by force, and by legal means. And it was sort of delegated by the British, but it got out of hand by the time of World War II. And they couldn't control the region anymore because of all of the scrutiny they were facing domestically. So after World War II, Britain was forced out of the Middle East. They could not maintain the relations there, and soon after World War II, they would kind of relinquish most of their territories that they had gained during World War I. And through that, the creation of Israel came to be, which was a Jewish-dominated country. And it was a Jewish-dominated society that would continue to impose all of these regulations on the Palestinians, and all of the legal mistreatment and exploitation of the Palestinians. A lot of them were put into slave labor, and a lot of them were sort of just separated from their families by force, because they would take their land and then they would kind of impose servitude on the most formidable, or just steal the women and children. So I'm giving all of this backstory to kind of explain why this professor was such a bad professor. But so this book that she assigned us talks about all of this, right? And in the middle of class one day, I try to bring up some of the things that were talked about in the book. And I tried to explain that it was a complicated situation. Excuse me. So I tried to explain that it was a complicated situation because World War II saw a lot of cultural changes, and the British were sort of facilitating this Jewish dominance in the region, out of, fear of being scrutinized by domestic, their own domestic affairs, and so they facilitated this transition to Jewish dominance in the region, and then legitimized it through the media and propaganda. And the U.S. did the same thing, because the U.S. had a huge hand in delegating the end of World War II as well. And so I was trying to bring this up in class, and I was trying to get to the bottom of her understanding of it, because her narrative was that the U.S. and Britain were entirely to blame for what happened to the Palestinians. And I felt like that was fairly inaccurate, because the U.S. did not have a hand in the Middle East until like close to the late 70s and the 80s, really. We didn't occupy there physically. Everything that we did as a country up to about the 70s and the 60s, the 70s and the 80s, was through the media, just like legitimizing Israel, essentially, which, was not great, but it was the British that went into the region, and it was the British that held the region for close to 100 years, and it was the British who imposed all of these policies that gave the Jewish people cultural dominance and allowed them to institute all of these policies that disenfranchised and dispersed the Palestinian people. And I was trying to talk about all of this stuff in class, and what she did, instead of trying to listen to me, is kept interrupting me the whole time, and then belittled me in front of the entire class, and then blamed it on the fact that I'm a straight white man. That actually, she literally said those words. And there was a Palestinian student in the class, and she started crying. She got upset. She stood up and pointed at me, and she said something, I can't even remember what it was, essentially like blaming me. And I had to sit there and assure the entire classroom that I was just trying to talk about the things in the book and try to get a better understanding of how she's trying to frame it, because I didn't hear America involved in the book hardly at all. And so I was trying to understand where she's getting this American criticism from, and it just became a train wreck. And thankfully, this Palestinian student was older. She was in her 40s. And so after the event happened, we took a break from class because everybody was crying. And I talked to her, and I was like, hey, I wasn't trying to, discount your experience or the experience of your people. I was just trying to understand the process of the things that were outlined in the book. I was literally talking about the pieces of information in the book, and we ended up becoming friends. I still see her at the gym sometimes, actually. But it was just a really shitty situation. And I had other professors that ran the class similarly. But thankfully, I had one other really good professor that I ended up taking for like 3 different classes. So I had her for like an entire year and a half. And the good professors outweighed the bad professors. But I kind of got lucky in that sense because I had some friends that were taking different history professors, and a lot of them were run with a very narrow view of history. And you really can't understand what happened until you have the entire piece. That's just a matter of fact. Everybody I've told that story to, though, has asked me why I didn't try to go to HR and file a complaint or something about that professor. And my main reason is that I knew nobody would listen to me. I understood the culture at UNT, and it wouldn't have gone anywhere. But that professor pulled me to the side during the break and was like, "I just wanted to use you as an example. I just want you to know that, because your background and your demographic shares those views a lot of the time." And I just felt like that was extremely condescending, because I was just focused on the facts. But like I said, this was a very emotional classroom, and I just don't see how you can take a professor seriously that gets emotional about learning about history. Because, to some degree, yes, emotion is warranted whenever you're reading about all of these tragedies and the way that these people were treated. But, this professor studied it for 10 plus years. You have to, at some point, try to be objective and understand why things happen instead of focusing so much on what actually happened. Because the why is the deeper question, and that's where I learned through my Roman military history class. That's where the strongest argument can be made by a historian. Because if you focus on the why, what you're doing is you're narrowing the focus of your studies, so you're not looking at anecdotal evidence that supports your confirmation bias. You're looking for real evidence that supports the events. And 2, you're also taking in context, which matters 100%. Because the whole struggle with history is knowing when to start, really. And so if you focus on the why, you can trace your steps back to the very beginning of an issue. And then you can make the strongest argument, working your way forward from there. Which is what I had to do for my Roman military history class. And I ended up only making an 86 in the class or something like that. But I felt like I learned the most out of any other class I took there. So those are that's the good and the bad history experiences that I had. And I still read history for fun. I read probably I don't know, 3 to 6 history books a year. Right now, I'm like halfway through a World War One book that I'm gonna get to reading again today. My girlfriend's gonna draw, and I'm gonna read after we go to the gym, which I'm glad she's gonna finally get a gym membership, because she's been talking about it for like 4 weeks now. Hopefully she didn't hear me. But I want to do a review on that book, because that book is really interesting too. And I just came across this guy. Oh yeah. So before I get into that, so why these experiences are extremely important to me, and I think relevant to society in general, is because you can see how these ideas have influenced every aspect of our culture. There's a propagandistic, like, there's a propagandistic narrative that is out there that's pushed on people through social media every day, and it really is from these people that think that they're smart, but are only taking the anecdotal pieces of evidence and are like very emotionally fueled. And something that I've been doing recently is watching a lot of like history of rock and roll, and kind of like personal stories of my favorite bands on YouTube. And I see a huge problem, because there's a lot of people that I know that don't listen to rock music, and simultaneously complain that there's no good rock bands anymore. And it's typically the average listener. But the problem really is that we don't allow, like, culturally, the people that make up the rock community, we don't allow anyone to become popular enough to kind of take up the mantle for the rock community. And it's mainly because nobody can agree on what is or isn't a actionable offense in the grand narrative of social media. And so people like come up with things all the time to try to discredit. And there's a book I'm going to start reading called The Red Decade, which is about the 1930s in America. Because if you're not aware, in the 1930s in America, there was a huge communist movement that was very fashionable, that instituted pretty much all facets of American society. And it was very, very, very influential and very effective. And we are living in a time that's mirroring that. And in this book, it goes into the idea of cancellation, because people were canceled in the same way that they're canceled now in the 1930s, whenever communism became fashionable. And what this book goes into is that it was really an adoption of the Stalinistic ideal, because Stalin at the time was so influential in, I guess, getting people ramped up and excited about communism. And you like actually saw these public politicians and public figures that would, in a lot of ways, give legitimacy to the powers imposed by Stalin, and then simultaneously flip their positions whenever something negative would come out about Russia. And so it was a very real time in American history, and we're living in a very similar era of it. But part of the reason why you can have like a rap or a pop artist that or a hip hop artist, like however you want to like categorize those things, why you have those kinds of artists that can go on like a conventional tour with like three other bands, or I'm sorry, three other musicians, and sell out arenas, and a lot of the most quote unquote popular rock bands that have come out, which there aren't many, but like the biggest ones being like the OCs and Idols, and like maybe you could even say Parquet Courts is up there, or like even, you know, Royal Blood, and I'm excluding like the Foo Fighters, because the Foo Fighters were established in a time period like way before social media was a thing. So, but like those kind of bands, those like more modern rock bands that have a lot of attention, the reason why those bands can't play those size venues unless they're on like some big festival is it really comes down to the understanding of the culture and what's tolerated within those cultures. Because you can say things in a rap song or in a pop song that you would be shunned for by the rock community. And I noticed this a very long time ago. Probably like 2016 or 2017, because I like rap. I listen to a lot of rap, and a lot of it is super offensive and overly sexual. And I mean, it is a fact. That's just kind of like part of the genre in a lot of ways. I mean, there's just like the images that appear in the music videos alone kind of like supports that claim. And so for some godforsaken reason, it's not tolerated in the rock community. And so what's happening is like the audience of rock listeners are going along with this culture war and are sort of buying into the propaganda that they're being sold on the internet, and really by you know, very powerful people, whether it be like businesses or the government, because this whole thing happened top down, or like even intellectual figures like within colleges, like it's being imposed top down, and there is an unrealistic scrutiny on art and like who it's made by. And so that's really why this is like turning out the way it is. And like, you know, with a genre that I'm very heavily influenced by and participate in punk. I mean, it's a genre that always gets a little bit less attention than whatever's the most popular thing at the time. I mean, that's why we call it pop music, is because it's safe. It doesn't typically say anything that surprises the average listener, whereas the whole idea of punk is like trying to push the envelope and see how fucked up you can make something. And in a lot of the same ways that like metal is the same, operates. So anyways, that is kind of like why these things happen. So if you like rock music and you are thinking that you're going to, at some point sell out arenas, good luck to you, because the likelihood that it'll happen is the lowest it's ever been. Not until we can kind of agree together within the rock culture that like talking about these things in music, or like writing songs about these things in music, isn't a problem. But the world has gotten very fragile and safe oriented, and the irony of that is that the more you try to control and create a quote unquote safe environment, the more you alienate the true diversity that can exist within that culture. And I think people are seeing that now, but it's like a very slow moving thing, and it's still broken up into factions. Nobody, like I said, nobody can agree like what is or isn't an actionable offense these days. So, I plan on giving a few book reviews soon, as I'm finishing this World War I book, and I need to get back to reading Infinite Jest again. I got to like page 700 and I stopped because I got busy. So I'm going to start picking these things back up now that I'm pretty much done with my portion of recording. So anyways, thanks for listening. I'm going to go to the gym.